Recently, I made a video about the 10-year-old Argentine chess sensation Faustino Oro, where I said that I thought he could very well be the next Magnus Carlsen. He's the youngest international master in history and has already scored wins against the world's top players, including Magnus, in online blitz and bullet. However, he is not the only potential threat to the throne of Magnus. There is another, and that is the 13-year-old Turkish prodigy Yağız Kaan Erdoğmuş, who just this past August became the youngest person ever to achieve a 2600 Fide live rating and is now currently rated 2601 on Fide's official October list. But unlike Faustino Oro, who broke his previous record of youngest IM by only a month, Yağız shattered his predecessor's record by a full year, held previously by the American John Burke, who crossed the 2600 level at age 14 back in 2015. So at age 13, Yağız needs to gain less than 300 rating points to catch up with Magnus, and he has a lot of years to do so. But nothing is set in stone, especially when you get up in that elite rating zone. But enough said, you're here to see the chess, and I have two incredible games to show you. The first is a rapid game in which Yağız defeats a strong grandmaster in only 14 moves. The second is a blitz game where he takes down none other than the great Magnus Carlsen himself. Both games are incredible and are not to be missed. So let's jump right in. In this first game, played in early August from this year's Fide World Rapid and Blitz Team Championships, Yağız is playing white and opens with d4 against his 2600 rated opponent, Darman Sadvakasov, who responds with knight to f6, preventing white from getting that ideal pawn center with e4. And we get bishop to g5 from Yağız, known as the Trompowsky variation. And this is an opening where white starts fighting for control of that e4 square right out of the gate, looking to potentially take on f6 and give up the bishop pair, for which he'll get some kind of compensation, whether it's an early e4, or for example, if black were to play d5, then taking the knight would land black with doubled pawns. So just one of several good options available to both players in this variation. But Darman goes for e6, creating a pin on his knight to the queen, which gives Yağız the immediate e4 he's looking for. But by playing it, Yağız has made a commitment to part with his bishop pair. For after h6, played by Darman, if white were to try to maintain the pin with bishop to h4, then black could kick that bishop to g3 with g5, and then take the pawn out with the knight. Which is why the only good move here for white is bishop takes f6. Played by Yağız, the queen recaptures, and now we have a significant imbalance in the position. White with the big ideal pawn center versus black with the bishop pair. But Yağız is seeking even more imbalance as evidenced by his next move, knight to c3. He's planning on castling queenside, which if Darman castles kingside like normal, this will be conducive to a very sharp, imbalanced game, as opposite-sided castlings are known to do. Next, we have a series of pawn moves from Darman, which seem to defy the conventional opening wisdom that says get your pieces out as fast as possible. But in chess, every rule has its exception, and this rule is no exception. Darman starts with d6. He wants to challenge that white pawn center with e5, and if pawn takes pawn, he would like to recapture on e5 with a pawn, as opposed to the queen, which white could attack with a developing move. Yağız plays queen to d2, he's going to castle next, and Darman doesn't play e5 just yet, since that would run into knight to d5, hitting the queen, threatening the fork. So queen to d8 would be forced, that's not ideal, so he makes one more preparatory pawn move, c6, covering that d5 square, so that after Yağız castles queenside, he can now strike at that center with e5, without any knight to d5. But these three consecutive pawn moves that Darman has made allow Yağız to now jump way ahead in development with knight to f3. He now has 4 of his pieces developed compared to Darman's 1 queen on f6, a fact that would make me very nervous as black here. But Darman knows that in this particular position, he can get away with it. Remarkably, white really doesn't have any advantage here. The engine's giving double zeros and actually recommended d5 gaining space instead of knight to f3. Now if it were white's turn to move here, he could take twice on e5 due to the mate threat on d8. So Darman puts a stop to that idea with knight to d7, a good move supporting e5, which Yağız now captures with d takes e5, which positionally speaking is not a good move. But you know what overrides positional considerations? Tactics. They are more important and will create beautiful exceptions to all kinds of positional rules. And this is a perfect example. If black could get away with recapturing on e5 with the pawn, then the pawn structure would become more or less symmetrical and white would no longer have the superior center or any space advantage to compensate him for black's bishop pair. But for tactical reasons, black should not recapture with the pawn. And before I show you why, let's first take a look at what Darman should have played but did not play, and that is the move knight takes e5. And after knight takes e5, capturing with the pawn still isn't good for the same reason as on the previous move, which will be revealed shortly. So queen takes e5 is necessary, allowing white to get in f4 with tempo on the queen, gaining some space. And so with his better development, his central control, and with the e pawn in the center versus black's somewhat backward d pawn, which can't advance, white has decent compensation for black's bishop duo. And the position is roughly equal. But in the game, Darman thought that he could get away with d takes e5. And maybe he was even surprised that Yağız would allow this transformation of the pawn structure, which would significantly favor black if not for a tactical shot that Yağız now uncorks. That must have come as quite a shock to Darman. And it's quite an amazing move. Pause the video if you'd like and try to spot it, but here it comes like a bolt from the blue. White's winning move is knight to b5. And this is actually a known opening trap, and a very effective one. The Lichess database shows that 63% of master level players and 71% of all players will fall for this when playing this line as black, failing to capture on e5 with the knight like they should. So this could be a very effective weapon for you to incorporate into your own opening repertoire. But let's take a look at this move knight to b5, starting with the most obvious, which is that a fork is threatened with knight to c7, and the fact that the knight can be captured with c takes b5. This wasn't played in the game, but if it had been, there would follow bishop takes b5, pinning and threatening to win that knight on d7. The black queen is the only piece that can add more defense, but after, let's say, queen to e6, there comes knight takes e5, hitting the knight with a fourth piece. So what to do? The engine suggests bishop to e7, but then white just gets the piece back on d7 and wins easily with the extra pawns. So what about queen takes e5, grabbing that second piece? Well, here, there's bishop takes d7 check. Now, if bishop takes d7, then queen takes d7 is mate. You can't do that. If king to e7, then bishop takes c8 will equalize the piece count while threatening queen to d8 checkmate. And black cannot grab that bishop on c8 with the rook without losing it to queen d7 check. Okay, so what about king to d8? Again, white plays bishop takes c8, discovered check, the piece count has equalized, and white's extra pawns and continued threats to the black king will decide the game. Since the only way to capture on c8 would be with king takes c8, but this of course allows that mate in one with queen to d8 checkmate. So an incredible line, but Darman didn't go down this road. In the game, he played the best defensive try, which is king to d8, preventing that knight fork and covering the c7 square. But now comes queen to a5 check from Yağız, which pretty much forces b6. If you try king to e7, white has multiple winning options. The engine gives knight to d6 as being strongest, and you can see black is just paralyzed. Both bishops blocked. White is threatening things like queen to c7, bishop to c4. I mean, this is like being a kid in the candy store. Knight to c7 is fun too, just hitting the rook. And any way black tries to defend will fail. For example, knight to b6 will lead to checkmate, starting with queen to c5. And if rook to b8, you have queen takes a7, now threatening to take on d7, followed by capturing the rook on b8. And there's a lot more we could look at. But black's pieces are so bad that, as Hans Niemann once said, I don't even need to show variations, you just look at the position. But let's take a look at what Darman played, which was b6, driving the queen back. She goes to c3, which is actually where Yağız should have put his queen a move earlier instead of playing to a5 first. Since this move b6, while it probably didn't save black, it does have the potential to make white work harder for the win, and you'll see why shortly. But here, white is threatening to capture on e5 with the queen or the knight, since the knight on d7 is pinned. Either capture would be devastating for black. After knight takes, for example, there's too many threats for black to deal with. The c6 pawn is under fire. There's bishop to c4, targeting f7, and even knight to d6 is still a threat here, since if bishop takes, white has queen takes c6, hitting the rook, hitting the bishop with the two pieces. So what do you think is black's best move here? C takes b5 is still not working, by the way, which is why Darman did not play it. Again, bishop takes b5 is just curtains for black, with no good defense against knight takes e5, and the winning of the piece back on d7. Bishop d6 would fail to queen to c6. King to e7 runs into queen to c7, repinning the knight, threatening to take on e5 again. And there's more defensive tries for black, all of which utterly fail. Here's just one example. a6, going for rook to a7 to defend the knight that way. Here, there's just bishop takes d7, and knight takes e5, after which rook to a7 runs into a fork with knight c6 check. The bishop is, of course, pinned to the king and can't capture. So in the game, Darman again declines taking the knight on b5, and instead plays the best move, which is not obvious, not to me anyway. Pause the video if you'd like to try and find it, but here it is, the only move to give black a fighting chance, and that is a6, simply threatening to answer knight takes e5 with c takes b5, when the bishop cannot recapture due to that extra coverage of b5. And this position shows why b6 was a useful move for black. If white had not played queen to a5, but instead played queen c3 immediately, then we could have had this position with this pawn still on b7 instead of b6. Then white could play queen to a5 check, and with no pawn to support b6, white could just capture that pawn if it were played, since that pawn would not be defended by the knight on d7, which is pinned to the king. And white, in that case, would have a crushing position, which you can explore further on your own if you'd like, but I want to press on. So in the game, Yağız realized that he's got to get his knight out of danger, and the best way to do it is to play to d6, threatening queen takes c6, which Darman should now allow by playing bishop takes d6. Which he doesn't do, but after queen takes c6, with the double attack on the rook and on the bishop, Darman probably took one look at this and thought, okay, white gets the piece back, my king's in the center, white's a pawn up, I'm just finished. And it's true that black is probably still lost, but he could have struggled on for quite a while with the move bishop to b7. And best for white is queen takes b7. You want to keep those queens on board, but after king to e7, there is no crushing follow-up. The engine gives this line, bishop c4, rook to d8, king b1, b5, bishop b3. These are all engine moves, and is saying that it's about 1.5 pawns in white's favor. Okay, white has the extra pawn, there's pressure on e5, which black is a little tied up defending at the moment. But here the game is far from over, and Darman would have undoubtedly preferred this over what he played in the game, had he foreseen what would happen after his next move, which in this position was the unfortunate king to c7. Defending the c6 pawn, which would be the best move if not for the horrific oversight, which cannot be blamed on time pressure. About 3 minutes was spent on this move king to c7, and most of you can probably identify the problem here for black without too much effort, which is of course knight to e8 check, a fork of the king and queen. A move which prompted immediate resignation by Darman Sadvakasov. So incredible play by Yağız, though not perfect, which kind of makes you wonder just how much of this opening trap he had seen previously. I suppose it could be possible that he just found the initial move knight to b5 over the board, but I suspect that he was aware of the idea, but maybe he didn't know or had forgotten what white's strongest continuation was, as evidenced by his move queen to a5 when queen to c3 was stronger. But defeating a 2600 rated player in 14 moves is quite a feat, not something you see every day. And if anyone can tell me how old this opening trap is that Yağız played, let me know in the comments, because I'm curious when it was first played and who was the first person to discover it. But moving on to our next game, this is the one you've all been waiting for. It's a 3-minute blitz game from June of this year, played on chess.com. Yağız has the white pieces. He's up against the mighty Magnus Carlsen, and he opens with c4. the English opening, to which Magnus responds symmetrically, until we reach move 3, where he plays g6, which Yağız now mimics with g3. Both bishops fianchetto, and now d6 from Magnus, opening a diagonal for his light-squared bishop, while keeping his intentions for the completion of his kingside development shrouded in mystery. Maybe knight to f6 is coming, maybe e5 followed by knight to e7. Knight to h6 is even played sometimes, looking at that f5 square. Yağız now castles, which triggers a strange decision from Magnus. Turns out the move d6 was not played to facilitate his light-squared bishop's development, because Magnus now blocks its diagonal with queen to d7, which is one of those moves that isn't a blunder, but according to the engine, it's counterproductive to the point where black would be better off if he could just skip his move altogether. So what is Magnus thinking here? Well, I suspect that he's just trying to get his young opponent out of his book, and he's not without a plan for his light-squared bishop. He's going to play b6 and bishop to b7. But white can now begin to get somewhat of an advantage if he were to play e3, followed by d4. When black's best way to combat this would involve the moves knight to h6 and bishop to g4, just maximizing control of the d4 square, threatening to remove one of its defenders. But of course, bishop to g4 has been rendered impossible for the moment due to this queen's position on d7. But Yağız plays a bit more tamely with b3, and after b6, bishop b2, and bishop to b7, we see even more symmetry. All four bishops now facing off on the long diagonals. Yağız now realizes that preparing d4 is his best plan, though it's not quite as good as it would have been a couple moves ago, because here Magnus has knight to e5, and after knight takes e5, how do you think he recaptures? With the bishop? Allowing d4 with tempo? No, he plays d takes e5, just locking down that d4 square. Now this wouldn't have worked quite as well for black if Yağız had played e3 a couple moves ago, before the queenside bishops had been developed, when black's pawn would still be on b7 and would be feeling some pressure from the g2 bishop and would be pinned to the rook. And the engine was suggesting that white follow up with rook to b1 and b4 to open the b file and increase the pressure. But here we pretty much have equality. And it's at this point Yağız does something very bold, very principled. First he captures on b7, drawing the black queen away from her view of d4, and then he proceeds to sacrifice a pawn there with the move d4. And this is the kind of thing you see engines do all the time, playing these moves that look like something you'd love to play eventually, but they just don't seem like they're properly prepared for yet. But when you have a lead in development and your opponent's king is in the center like this, these are the kinds of moves you want to be looking for. So let's see what happens. Magnus takes, and we have e takes d4. And now for a challenging question. Should black take with the bishop or with the pawn? What would you do? C takes d4 is very playable, but after knight to d5, that pawn is hit twice. And if you try e6 to kick that knight away, then bishop takes d4 is actually playable, since it comes with a threat to the bishop on g7, and of course if the bishops are traded on d4, then the queen is threatening the rook. You could also play rook to e1, just pinning the e-pawn. So Magnus opts for bishop takes d4, after which he's a clear pawn up. But this move is only slightly better than c takes d4, if at all, and the reason is because of a move that Yağız did not play. But take a look and try to find it if you want. White's best move in this position is queen to e2, which does a couple of things. It gets the queen off of this d-file, where she would be vulnerable after rook to d8, and it pins the e-pawn to the king, so that if black just develops normally with knight to f6, then there's knight to b5, hitting the bishop on d4 with two pieces, while simultaneously threatening knight to d6 check, which would win the queen due to the fork and the fact that the e-pawn is pinned. So the engine's saying that black should castle long with knight takes d4, c takes d4, and eventually white rounds up the pawn on d4 like so. And with correct play from both sides, this should end in a draw. But Yağız, instead of playing the correct queen to e2, went with rook to e1, giving Magnus the opportunity to add protection to d4 with rook to d8, with the threat to the white queen with bishop takes c3 or bishop takes f2. So you got to get out of the way of that. Queen to e2 is played, and after knight to f6 from Magnus, knight to b5 would no longer be as good since knight to d6 is no longer a threat. The rook is covering that square. So Magnus is just a clean pawn up here, but it is blitz and anything can still happen. We have rook a to d1, placing the rook on the only open file, which is very rarely the worst thing you can do, and here it's actually the best. Now if Magnus wants to hang on to his extra pawn, he needs to add more defense to e7 before he castles to prevent the white queen from capturing there, which is why rook to d7 is the best move in this position. But instead he gets provocative with h5, dreaming of a mating attack down the h-file. But this is a mistake, which Yağız now exploits with the best move in the position, knight to b5, hitting the bishop with 3 pieces. But after bishop takes b2, he's got the in-between move, rook takes d8 check, drawing the black king out from behind its pawn shield after king takes d8, while depriving him of the right to castle. Yağız now recaptures on b2, and Magnus has a bit of a problem. His king is sitting on an open file, and he'd like to move that king towards the queen side so his rook can get into the action, but king to c8 would fail to queen takes f6, followed by a knight fork on d6, by which white gets the queen back with a winning position since his rook will be penetrating to the 7th rank with check, and he will get his pawn back with interest. So Magnus plays a good move, rook to e8. Now king to c8 is on the cards, since white's queen takes f6 tactic would no longer work due to the threat of rook takes e1 after the pawn captures there. But here Yağız could begin with knight d6, forcing e takes d6, allowing queen takes f6 with check, not winning or anything, but it's probably white's strongest option. But Yağız instead goes for rook to d1 with check, very natural, getting the rook off of this e-file so that if Magnus tries king to c8, the queen takes f6 tactic is again available to white, since after e takes f6 and knight to d6 check, there is no threat of rook takes e1. Although this time black would not be losing, he'd have the doubled pawns, and white could still penetrate to the 7th rank, but here black's rook would be on an open file and would have enough activity to secure the draw. But Magnus must not have liked this for whatever reason, and instead goes into a self-pin with knight to d7. At which point we have a sneaky move from Yağız, queen to e2. He knows that Magnus wants to play king to c8 to get off that open file, but if it's played now, I think most of you know what's coming next, which is knight to d6, a triple fork, and if the knight is captured, the rook on e8 goes away. To chess piece heaven, or maybe hell, but Magnus knows exactly what Yağız is up to, and he said, let's get that knight out of there with a6. The engine was giving the very engine-y move h4 as being best, trying to disrupt things over here on the king side, while maintaining the status quo here in the center. But what human is going to want to keep their king on an open file, right? Yağız plays knight to c3, and again h4 is best, but Magnus is not in engine mode today. Sometimes he does have that switched off. Is it by choice? No one knows. But he plays king to c8 as planned, and now here comes knight to e4. The strongest move, threatening the triple fork with knight to d6, exploiting that pin on the e-pawn. The best way to answer this is to move the rook. But the best square to move this rook to is not so obvious. Try to spot it if you'd like, but here it comes. Black's best defense is rook to f8. Looks odd, but the reason is that anywhere else, white would have knight to g5, which would attack both f7 and the pawn on e7 at the same time. But Magnus didn't even move the rook. He tried knight to e5, which is a blunder of the highest order. And by highest, I do mean worst. Okay, so he has blocked the file, so knight to d6 check is not working, but Yağız can and does attack that knight with the move f4. The knight can't move away, of course, or else there's knight d6. So all Magnus can do is counterattack with f5. But now we get knight to g5 from Yağız. It's the best move, and it covers f3, which may have been what Magnus overlooked. If he could get his knight out of danger with check, he would still be in the game. But white's got that square covered, so here he can only move the knight backwards. Knight to d7 would allow an annoying pin with queen to e6, with the king tied down to defending. So what's tried is knight to c6. At least maybe he can get to that nice d4 square at some point, but spoiler alert, it never happens. Because Yağız now has queen to e6 with check, and after king to b8, do you think he grabs on g6? No, he's got bigger fish to fry. He's got rook to d7, after which queen to c8 is the only reasonable try, at least touching the rook there, and so preventing queen takes g6. But now Yağız plays his 9th consecutive top engine move, knight to f7. The threat is simply knight to e5, hitting the knight on b6, to which black has no good defense, since if you were to take on e5 with the knight, queen takes b6 would force checkmate in 2 moves. The engine is giving king to a8 as black's best defense, since after knight to e5 you can capture there and at least queen takes b6 isn't coming with check. But this is no real solution. The white queen and rook are in such a dominating position that everything is hopeless for black. But what Magnus tries is knight to a5, so that after queen takes b6 check, played by Yağız, he does avoid that mate in 2 by throwing his knight in the way. However, this does not avoid a mate in 5, beginning with the 11th consecutive top engine move, played now by Yağız, the crushing knight to e5, threatening knight to c6 check. And if king to a8, queen to a7 will be mate. So Magnus, in anticipation of this, plays king to a8, but after queen takes a6 check, which will force his king back to b8, Magnus resigns, seeing that king to b8 will be met with knight c6 check, to which black's only legal response is to sacrifice his queen, and mate will follow shortly. So a very convincing defeat of the world's #1 player in 3-minute blitz by this up-and-coming contender for the world title. Just want to put that out there. It's not guaranteed, of course. Progress gets harder to predict as one enters that rarefied air approaching the Super GM zone. But so far, Yağız Erdoğmuş is right on track to make a serious play for the World Championship, possibly within the next 10 years, which will be a critical time period. We're going to either hear a lot more about this kid very soon, or he's going to fizzle out. I mean, if you want to call being a strong grandmaster fizzling out, I would love to fizzle out like that for the rest of my life. But give me all of your opinions about this kid. Do you think the next 5 years is going to be all about Yağız Erdoğmuş or the Argentine prodigy Faustino Oro? Or neither? But thanks for watching. Hit that subscribe button if you want to, and I will see you very soon.